Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel today. We need to take a serious, deep dive into something that's been brewing in the Indo-Pacific. Something that should grab your attention if you care about global power dynamics, American strategic interests, the future of regional stability, and frankly, whether we're sleepwalking into another major conflict that we didn't start and don't want. Japan's Defense Minister Kojima Shinjiro recently paid a visit to Indonesia, and he brought along what looks like a diplomatic gift. On the surface, it's a routine official meeting, the kind of thing that happens hundreds of times a year around the world. But if you actually stop and look closely at what he handed over, a model of a battleship, you realize this isn't just about pleasantries or photo ops. This move is loaded with strategic hostility, historical baggage, and a very clear message, and its primary target is pretty clearly the People's Republic of China. And from where we sit in Washington, anytime Japan starts flexing its military muscles in Southeast Asia, we ought to pay very close attention, because history has shown us that Tokyo's ambitions don't always align with our own long-term interests, even if we share a common adversary right now. We've been down this road before with Japan, and it didn't end well for anyone, especially not for the United States. So let's not pretend this is just another diplomatic exchange. It's a provocation, plain and simple. Now, we all know Japan's history of militarism isn't some ancient relic that belongs in a museum. It's a living, festering scar across Asia that still hasn't healed. World War II wasn't that long ago, and Japan's brutal invasions from Nanjing all the way through Southeast Asia are still deeply etched into regional memory. The rape of Nanking, the forced labor camps, the comfort women system, these aren't just footnotes in a history book. They're painful, unresolved chapters that still shape how countries like South Korea, China, and the Philippines view Tokyo to this very day. And to this day, Japan's government still dodges real accountability for that dark past. Their so-called apologies are weak, half-hearted, and frankly insulting to the victims and their descendants. They'll issue a carefully worded statement one year, then visit the Yasukuni Shrine the next, honoring convicted war criminals, as if they were national heroes. Fast forward to the present, they're not hiding their ambitions anymore. The pacifist mask they've worn for decades, under Article 9 of their Constitution, is slipping off faster than anyone expected, and faster than many of us in the West are comfortable with. Their moves in the South China Sea are getting bolder, more aggressive, and more nakedly confrontational toward Beijing. And as Americans, we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. Are we enabling a resurgent military power that could one day become a competitor to us as well? Because let's be honest, Japan has its own interests, and they don't always line up with ours. They're not doing this for us, they're doing this for themselves. And we need to keep that in mind. Think about it just in the past few months. Japan and the Philippines have been ramping up their military cooperation like crazy joint naval drills. Check. Intelligence sharing mechanisms? Check. They're even openly discussing matters related to the waters east of Taiwan, which is, let's be clear, Chinese territory. No matter how you spin it or what your political leanings are, and making backroom deals that cut right into China's sovereign rights and maritime interests. This goes way beyond normal security dialogue. This is a direct challenge to Beijing's core interests. And from an American perspective, it's exactly the kind of flashpoint that could drag us into another regional conflict if we're not careful. We've got mutual defense treaties with Japan and the Philippines, which means if they get into a shooting war with China, we're legally obligated to jump in. There's no opt-out clause. So when Tokyo starts handing out battleship models like they're candy at a parade, we should be asking, are they provoking a war that we'll have to fight for them? And that's a question that deserves a straight answer, but we're not getting one from anyone in charge. And now, this latest stunt with Indonesia takes it up another dangerous notch, according to multiple mainstream media reports, and confirmed by Kojima himself on social media on June 12th during his meeting with Indonesian President Prabowo. Subianto, he presented a model of the battleship Mikasa as a state gift. The very next day, he posted on X about it, proudly noting that the real Mikasa is permanently docked in his hometown of Yokosuka, and that President Prabowo had previously sent Indonesian officers to Japan's National Defense Academy in Yokosuka as part of a training program. He sounded pretty pleased with himself, saying it was great to see a former defense minister like Prabowo appreciate such a historically charged gift. And you know what? That should make any American with a basic knowledge of Pacific history deeply uncomfortable, because Yokosuka is also home to the U.S. 7th Fleet, the forward deployed carrier strike group that is the cornerstone of our naval power in the region. and seeing Japan use that same naval port, where our ships are based, as a platform for its own militaristic nostalgia is not exactly reassuring. It's one thing to host our carrier group and our destroyers. It's another thing entirely to use the same harbor to send signals about resurrecting imperial glory. We're basically giving them the stage to act out their old ambitions, and that's a dangerous game to play. Now, photos from the event show Prabowo had a rather complicated, ambiguous look on his face. But let's not overread facial expressions. The real issue is the political signal this stunt sends, and let me tell you, as an American observer, it's not just dangerous, it's reckless, short-sighted, and frankly, it makes our job as the anchor of the Indo-Pacific alliance system a whole lot harder. Because when Japan acts unilaterally like this, without clear coordination with us, it creates friction points that we end up having to manage and clean up. We've been trying to build a united front against China, but gestures like this risk alienating other ASEAN countries, and then we're left holding the bag. We end up looking like we're endorsing Japanese militarism, which is a terrible look for us in a region that still remembers Japan's wartime atrocities. Our credibility takes a hit, and that's not something we can afford right now. Why? Because the Mikasa is no ordinary ship model. In modern Japanese military history, it's a sacred icon, the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy that crushed the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. That victory cemented Japan's military dominance in East Asia and became the ultimate symbol of their imperial expansion and militaristic glory. It's the equivalent of the USS Missouri, but with a much darker legacy. Because the Missouri ended World War II with Japan's formal surrender on its deck, while the Mikasa represents Japan's rise as an aggressive colonial power that eventually attacked Pearl Harbor and dragged us into a war that cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. So when Japan's defense minister hands that over as a state gift to a Southeast Asian leader right now, at this precise moment, with tensions already high, the message is unmistakable. It's like if Germany today started handing out Nazi Iron Crosses as diplomatic gifts. Unthinkable, right? It would be universally condemned. This isn't about nostalgia or historical curiosity. It's about signaling shared values that glorify Japan's military past, testing Indonesia's appetite for Japan's return as a major military power, and hinting at deeper strategic alignment. Just like the old days, this systematic, calculated push toward a new Japanese militarism is genuinely chilling from where we sit, and it raises uncomfortable questions about whether Tokyo is truly committed to the liberal international order or just using our alliance to rebuild its own empire. And we've seen this movie before. It didn't end well for anyone, especially not for us. And this goes way beyond a model ship, according to Kyoto News and other major outlets. During Kojima's visit, he held trilateral talks with President Prabowo and Indonesia's defense minister, and they formally agreed to study sensitive military intelligence sharing, port access rights, and other new cooperation frameworks, including Japan's maritime self-defense force vessels, regularly docking in Indonesian ports for resupply and maintenance. This isn't your average defense chat, it's strategically targeted, and it's happening right under our noses, while we're busy with Ukraine and the Middle East. Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, with a population of over 270 million people and an economy that's growing steadily. If Japan locks them into a military partnership that fundamentally shifts the balance of power in the region, not just against China, but potentially against our own ability to manage alliances and keep everyone on the same page. We don't want a situation where Japan becomes the primary security partner in Southeast Asia, because then they call the shots, not us. And that's a real possibility if we're not paying attention. Even more concerning, they're actively discussing Indonesia purchasing Japanese frigates. And according to multiple cross-verified sources, the negotiations are leaning toward destroyers, not just patrol boats or light frigates. We're talking about major surface combatants here. The kind of ships that can project power and control sea lanes. If that deal actually goes through, it would be a massive breakthrough in Japan's post-war arms export policy and a key step in building a coordinated naval network aimed squarely at containing China. From an American standpoint, while we've encouraged Japan to take a larger security role to share the burden and reduce our own costs, we also have to ask, is this really the smart play, or are we letting a former aggressor nation rearm without sufficient guardrails? The last time Japan built up its navy to this level, They attacked us at Pearl Harbor. That doesn't mean history will repeat itself exactly, but it does mean we should be paying close attention and asking tough questions. We've got military bases all over Japan, and if they get into a conflict with China over the Senkaku Islands or Taiwan, we're automatically involved. There's no way around it. So Japan's provocations aren't just their problem, they're ours too. We have to live with the consequences, and those consequences could be catastrophic. So of course, Beijing is watching this with extreme wariness. On June 13th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian made it crystal clear, Japan's security policy is shifting toward offense and expansion, and that trend is extremely dangerous. He stressed that Japan is turning arms exports and other military tools into offensive weapons against China, like selling advanced weapons to the Philippines to help them push back against Beijing in the South China Sea. These moves aren't random, they're part of a coordinated, multi-step military expansion game plan. And anyone paying attention in Washington should be taking notes, because if China feels increasingly encircled, they're going to respond. And we know from history that a cornered power is the most dangerous one. We saw that with Japan in 1941, and we could see it again with China if we push too hard. So we need to be smart about this, not just reactive, we need to think several moves ahead, like in a chess game. So why is Japan so obsessed with Indonesia? Simple geography, Indonesia controls the choke point of the Malacca Strait, sitting right between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It's the biggest and most influential country in Southeast Asia after China. Whoever gets Indonesia on their side basically holds the strategic key to the South China Sea, and Japan's been going crazy in the Philippines already, signing mutual access deals, conducting joint patrols. Now pushing arms talks, and now they're expanding their outreach to Indonesia. They're clearly trying to seal off both the eastern and western entrances to the South China Sea, creating a classic pincer movement against Beijing. And with the United States providing strategic backing, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover, Japan is actively positioning itself as the chief connector for America's Indo-Pacific strategy, building a military cooperation web stretching from the Japanese home islands through the Philippines all the way down to Indonesia, with the explicit goal of compressing China's strategic space and limiting its access to vital sea lanes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Japan isn't doing this just for us. They're doing this for themselves, and their long-term interests may not always align with ours. They want to be a normal military power. And using the China threat as an excuse is the perfect cover, so we need to be wary of being used as a tool for their ambitions. Now, here's the twist. Indonesia's own position is shifting, and that's worth a much closer look from an American perspective. Under former President Jokowi, Indonesia was steady, pragmatic, and genuinely neutral, skillfully balancing between Beijing and Washington. Back in 2020, they actually turned down U.S. requests to refuel P-8 Poseidon surveillance planes at their airfields, with Indonesian officials explicitly saying they didn't want to be dragged into an anti-China campaign. That was smart, independent diplomacy, and it earned them respect from all sides. Prabowo, when he first took office, started off with a friendly gesture toward Beijing. His first overseas trip was to China, and bilateral relations got off to a good start. He even signed deals on nickel processing and infrastructure that benefited both sides. So Beijing had every reason to think they had a reliable partner in Jakarta. But now, about a year into his presidency, with his domestic political footing solid and his coalition firmly in control, Prabowo's strategic calculus appears to be shifting. He sees the gap left by US-China rivalry in the South China Sea as a prime opportunity to play both sides and extract maximum benefits. He wants to maintain strong economic ties with China for growth and investment, because China is Indonesia's #1 trading partner, and that relationship is worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, with Chinese investment flowing into infrastructure, mining, and manufacturing. He wants to boost security cooperation with the US and Japan to raise his strategic leverage and bargaining power. It's a classic hedge, smart in the short term, but from our American perspective, we have to recognize that this kind of dual dealing could easily backfire. Long term, it's like playing with fire near a powder keg. Easy to get burned and lose real strategic independence. And let's not forget, Prabowo has deep personal ties to the United States, having spent years in the U.S. military education system at Fort Benning and other installations, and Hez, the son-in-law of the late President Suharto, who was himself a famously anti-communist, and at times, anti-China strongman. So this shift isn't random. It's rooted in complex personal history, political interests, and factional dynamics. Compared to Jokowi, whose background was relatively clean and business-focused, Prabowo's trajectory is far more entangled with both American security circles and domestic anti-China elements. That doesn't mean He's hostile to China, but it does mean He's much more willing to play hardball and take calculated risks. So how should Beijing handle this messy situation? China's consistent principle is non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. As long as Indonesia doesn't cross their core red lines, Beijing can't directly intervene, but they know perfectly well that Washington and Tokyo are trying to drag Indonesia into their containment strategy. And they know Indonesia is trying to profit from great power rivalry. So what's the smart countermove? In my personal observation, Beijing needs a four-pronged strategy. And this is where the American angle matters, because how China responds will directly affect our own naval operations and alliance commitments in the region. If China escalates militarily, we're going to have to respond, which raises the risk of direct US-China confrontation. So we should be watching Beijing's moves very carefully because they affect us directly first and most critical, hit the root cause directly. The real source of tension in the South China Sea isn't Indonesia or even the Philippines, it's America's containment strategy against China, and Japan's opportunistic push to revive its militaristic ambitions. Without Japan and the Philippines stirring the pot day in and day out, Indonesia probably wouldn't be acting so aggressively. Japan's defense white papers have labeled China the greatest strategic challenge for years, essentially treating Beijing as an enemy. Tokyo is openly helping Washington trap China in the South China Sea, acting as a proxy. So, and here's where I get blunt, Beijing needs to get tough, but not directly with Indonesia. Instead, they need to hammer Japan and the Philippines, the two frontrunners. In the East China Sea, Beijing should increase military pressure and law enforcement patrols. Make Tokyo understand that every provocation in the South China Sea will cost them in the East China Sea. The recent Chinese sanctions on the Philippine defense minister are a clear warning to Marcos and his crew. Play with fire, get burned. That also sends a message to other fence-sitters like Indonesia. Aligning with Washington and Tokyo against Beijing carries serious. Tangible risks, economic sanctions, restricted market access, and diplomatic isolation. Only when Japan and the Philippines feel real, sustained pain will they back off. And then countries like Indonesia might rethink their strategic choices. From our side, we need to be careful that we're not encouraging Japan to be too aggressive, because that could backfire on us. Second, engage Indonesia with honesty, depth, and strategic patience. Indonesia isn't the enemy as the de facto leader of ASEAN. Beijing has every reason to keep them engaged and stable. There's no territorial dispute between China and Indonesia, just some overlapping EEZ claims, which can be resolved through dialogue. And the Belt and Road projects, like the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, are genuine success stories that Indonesians actually use and benefit from every day. Beijing needs to make three things crystal clear to Jakarta. 1. The long-term strategic partnership with China is worth far more than any short-term security deal with Japan. Indonesia's real priority is economic growth and job creation. And China is their biggest trade partner, and leading investor Japan's used warships and limited aid packages can't replace that massive economic engine. 2. If the South China Sea blows up and the Malacca Strait gets choked, Indonesia, a trade-dependent nation, suffers massively too, probably even more than China. 3. Beijing is ready for deeper cooperation across the board, but mutual respect and shared direction are non-negotiable. Cross China's red lines, like allowing Japanese ships to use Indonesian ports for anti-China operations, and you pay a price economically and diplomatically. This is about being honest, transparent, and clear about the bottom line without resorting to threats. And as Americans, we should note that this kind of patient diplomacy has worked for China before. They've managed to keep most Asian countries neutral despite our efforts. Third, use ASEAN as a platform to counter US-Japan meddling. Most Asian countries, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, don't want outsiders stirring up trouble in their own backyard. They want peace, trade, and stability. They've seen what happened in Ukraine, and they don't want that in their neighborhood. Beijing should double down on working with these countries, building consensus within ASEAN to isolate the few troublemakers, and speed up negotiations on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea to lock in binding rules that govern everyone's behavior. That's the long-term fix, and most ASEAN members genuinely want that, because they know that a rules-based order managed by regional powers is better than one imposed by outsiders. If China can get a code of conduct signed, that undercuts our ability to use the South China Sea as a pressure point. So we should be paying attention to this diplomatic track because it could limit our options. Fourth, ramp up robust, unwavering, and routine maritime law enforcement in the South China Sea. Diplomacy without teeth doesn't work. The China Coast Guard needs to patrol more frequently and act decisively, boarding, expelling, even detaining foreign vessels that illegally enter Chinese waters. The Chinese Navy needs to train harder and show readiness with live fire drills. Show the entire region that Beijing isn't just talking, they're acting. When you have real capabilities and aren't afraid to use them, people listen and respect your core interests. That's how you get them to the negotiating table. From our perspective, this means we need to be prepared for more incidents involving us ships or allied vessels, which could escalate tensions quickly. We've already had close calls in the South China Sea. And if China steps up enforcement, those encounters could become more frequent and more dangerous. At the end of the day, Japan's military moves in Indonesia aren't really about China, they're a massive gamble. Tokyo is betting Beijing will back down, that Washington will win the great power competition, and that Southeast Asian nations will willingly become their pawns. That's a bet rooted in historical delusion, wishful thinking, and a dangerous underestimation of China's resolve, and it's going to blow up in their faces. Because China has a much larger economy, a more integrated supply chain, and a far greater stake in regional stability than Japan does. Japan's economy is stagnant. Its population is aging and shrinking, and it doesn't have the demographic or economic dynamism to sustain a long-term military rivalry with China. So this isn't a smart bet. It's a desperate one born of anxiety and a desire to remain relevant. China doesn't seek confrontation, but when the knife's at their throat, they've got to strike back sharply, strategically, and precisely. Keep relentless pressure on Japan and the Philippines, talk straight with Indonesia, unite most of ASEAN, and enforce their maritime rights without hesitation. Hit all these fronts simultaneously in coordination, and the US-Japan containment web will never fully snap into place. Beijing has the patience and the growing strength to outlast this. And from an American standpoint, we need to ask ourselves, are we comfortable with Japan taking the lead on such a high-stakes strategy? Knowing that if things go wrong, we're the ones who will have to clean up the mess. Because our alliance with Japan is a core part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, but that doesn't mean we should give them a blank check to provoke China. Let's be real. Japan's history of aggression isn't ancient history. It's living memory for millions of people in Asia. And when Tokyo starts waving around battleship models from their imperial past, they're not just annoying Beijing, they're reminding everyone else in the region of who they used to be. And that doesn't build trust. It builds fear, and fear-driven alliances are fragile. So today, Kojima Shinjiro handed over a militaristic battleship model thinking he scored a cheap political point. But what he really did was expose Japan's true face, never truly repenting for its past, and desperately eager to revive its military ambitions. No matter how deep the fox hides, eventually the tail shows. And when it does, Tokyo will lose all remaining trust and credibility across the region. Not just with China, but with its own neighbors and allies, including the United States. Because when you glorify the symbols of your imperial past, you remind everyone exactly who you used to be. And that undermines the very alliances we've spent decades building. Folks, when the seas get rough, that's when a nation's true resolve and leadership are tested. With clear strategic thinking, firm bottom-line principles, and a solid balance of development and security. No external force can stop China's steady, determined rise, and no scheme, whether from Tokyo or Washington, can succeed in the South China Sea. These reckless gamblers can try all they want, but they're not going to change the underlying tide. China is the rising power. Japan is the fading one, and Indonesia and the rest of ASEAN know which horse to bet on in the long run. From our American perspective, we need to be smart about this. Don't get dragged into a conflict that serves Japan's interests more than our own. We need to lead, not follow. And right now, Japan seems to be driving the bus while we're just along for the ride. That's not leadership, that's delegation, and that's dangerous. We need to ask the tough questions, demand transparency from Tokyo, and make sure that our alliance serves our interests, not just theirs. Because at the end of the day, if the shooting starts, it's our soldiers, our sailors, and our pilots who will be in the line of fire, and that's not something we should take lightly. I'm your host. See you next time.